Welcome to Viewed It. Today I'm going to show you an American thriller film called Hush. Warning. Spoilers ahead. Maddie, a young woman and successful horror story author, lost both her ability to hear and speak after contracting bacterial meningitis at a young age. Despite being both deaf and slightly mute, she receives international critical acclaim for her first successful novel Midnight Mass. In hope to advance her career, Maddie moves from her home in New York to adopt a more isolated lifestyle, a remote cabin off the grid, with her cat, to work on her next novel. The movie begins with Maddie in her home, taking a break from writing, to cook herself an early and very delicious-looking dinner. While browsing the internet for recipes, she receives a text message from her next-door neighbor Sarah, who asks to stop by, while waiting for her boyfriend to return from work. Maddie tastes the dish she's cooking, and isn't pleased with the result, but she gladly accepts Sarah's company. Sarah shortly makes her way up Maddie's driveway. The expression on Maddie's face shows us that Maddie is glad to have someone visit her. Once Sarah makes it to her door, Maddie's greeted with a soft hug and a smile. Sarah holds up the Midnight Mass book and explains to her friend that she finished her book. And in respect for her friend, she shows Maddie how far that she's come along in her pursuit to learn sign language. The two converse for a while, then Maddie changes the topic to ask Sarah what she thinks of her book. Sarah responds how she loved it, particularly the ending, and asks her the secret to creating such a compelling ending. Maddie calls the secret writer's brain, the voice in her mind that narrates the perfect ending, and how the voice sounds similar to the voice of her mother. Sarah tries complimenting her friend's talents in sign language, but instead of calling Maddie a good writer, she accidentally calls her a good kisser. The two can't help but laugh at the moment. Shortly after, Maddie's fire alarm loudly chimes, causing them to turn around and look towards the flashing and smoke inside. Maddie and Sarah bolt inside towards the alarm in the kitchen. Though unable to hear the alarm, she quickly turns it off. Sarah, on the other hand, is luckily able to remove the burning food from the oven. They take a breath of relief as Maddie apologizes. But Sarah isn't upset, just glad that she isn't hurt. Maddie begins to explain to Sarah that she's unable to hear the fire alarm, but instead feels the vibrations of the sound, especially when she's peacefully asleep in bed. After their dilemma, the two women find themselves outside again. The sun starts to set. Sarah asks Maddie about her cat, and if she would be okay by herself out in the woods at night. And Maddie, very confident in her independent companion, to say it lightly, claims that she will be fine. The two sit silently for a moment listening to the sound of the crickets humming in the woods. Sarah pats her leg, and apologizes about dinner, and instead asks if Maddie would like to come over for takeout and a movie, with her and her boyfriend John. But Maddie politely declines, remembering that she has to return to her work. Sarah tells her she understands and once again, thanks her for giving her the opportunity to read the novel. Preparing to leave, Sarah shows her the phrases in sign language that Maddie taught her earlier, and promises that she will be back to visit in the morning. As Sarah exits down the driveway, Maddie's phone vibrates in her pocket, and when she unlocks it, there is a text message from her ex-boyfriend Craig that says, "Thought of you today." Maddie, unhappy with the awkward gesture, deletes the conversation and places her phone back down on the table inside. She looks around her kitchen, sighing at the mess of the day. The camera pans over her brightly lit cabin, back to Maddie, sitting Indian style on her couch, eating a TV dinner with her laptop open on her lap. She glances over the half-written and unfinished start of her next novel, again sighing at the thought. Attempting to find motivation, she begins to read the words on the pages, hearing the voice of her mother reading the pages aloud. She tries to find a flow, though unsuccessfully, skimming through the book's 7 pages until the voice, that was reading a story, becomes her consciousness, and tells her to scrap the story and start over. As the pressure of her day begins to set in, she finds herself procrastinating again, but this time opening FaceTime, calling her ex-lover multiple times, and ending the call midway. He tries calling her back, but she ignores it, regretting her decision to return to the mess in her kitchen. Outside, Sarah, scared and beaten, runs to her kitchen door, frantically pounding against the glass of her door, and pleading for her to open it, and let her in. Maddie, unfortunately, unable to hear her, continuing the task at hand, as her friend, hurt and afraid, attempts to get her attention. A bowl flies through the air, directly into Sarah's shoulder, causing her to gasp and lean against the glass. A man in a white mask casually walks up behind her, pinning her against the wall, turning her towards him, proceeding to stab her multiple times, killing Sarah in the process. Sarah's lifeless body falls to the ground. Her killer then turns to Maddie, cleaning and oblivious to anything that has happened, eerily watching her as she casually goes on about her business. He taps on the glass of her door to get her attention, and just like Sarah, fails. And after so many unsuccessful attempts, he turns away to finish the job that he started. Maddie finishes cleaning her kitchen, her phone begins to ring. It's Craig again. Maddie ignores his attempt, and as the phone continues to ring, she reopens her computer and returns to her work. As she writes, her sliding door slowly opens without her noticing. The masked man enters, as she casually types random words onto the document. He slowly creeps up behind her, drawing his knife, tapping on it to get her attention. Until she receives a call from her sister on FaceTime, causing him to move out the view of her camera. Her and her sister joke about a writer's block on FaceTime, and how much Maddie dreads writing the book, and how Craig continually is calling her. We learn it's been years since they've broken up, and she's getting back into the dating world by joining a deaf dating website. Her sister insists that she move back to New York with her, but Maddie declines. Behind her, her stalker picks her phone up from the table her sister sees. She asks what it was that she saw moving in the background. Maddie smiles and tells her it was probably the cat, and how she escaped earlier, thanking her for reminding her to go look for her. They end their FaceTime call, now slightly relieved. Maddie closes her computer, returning to her cat's bowl, shaking it in the doorway, as she attempts to lure her cat back inside. When she realizes her cat isn't coming, she walks through the house, continually shaking the bowl, looking around to see where her cat could be. From the living room to the bathroom, to her upstairs and back outside, confused, she leaves the sliding door open, just in case the cat comes back. It's cold outside. She puts on a jacket and returns to the couch, reopening her computer to a text message from her personal phone number. She opens her messages to a photo of herself on the computer in her living room from earlier. Then more messages appear of her roaming through her home looking for her cat. And finally, the last photo, the present, in shock, as she awaits another photo to show up in the app. She slowly turns her head in the direction of the open door behind her. Afraid, she hesitantly walks across the room towards the doorway, to find the masked man standing a few feet away from the door waiting for her. He holds the phone up in the air with the messaging app open and waves it, playfully, in front of her. Maddie bolts towards the door and quickly shuts it before the man has a chance to stop her. They stare at each other for a moment, as the masked man casually walks towards the next point of entry. She quickly follows him, preventing any possible opportunity he could use to get inside. The man, realizing this, begins to make his way back to the kitchen door, before Maddie, but luckily the door was previously locked. He shakes the door's handle, and for a moment, stares at her, then walking back, just outside her house, to stare at her eerily through the kitchen window. He turns and walks around the house, removing the crossbow from his back, towards another door, where Maddie hastily locks it shut. He again looks around for a moment, and begins walking. Maddie, after securing all of the door locks, runs to her laptop and attempts to call the police. But her pursuer shuts off the power to her house, cutting off her signal to the internet, ending the connection before the call goes through. She searches for another network to connect to, realizing that the only one that she has access to is Sarah and John's, which is locked behind a password she doesn't know. She looks up towards the window, to the masked man staring at her, and running his bloody knife over the glass, leaving her pale in the face, as he walks off again. She slowly stands, and runs towards each of the windows in the dark living room towards the glass sliding door again. Outside, she watches as the masked man slowly pokes holes in each of her car's tires, removing any hopes that Maddie may have had of escape. A tear drops down the side of Maddie's face as the realization of her situation sets in. She glances around the dark room, attempting to find a way out. She glances at her bag, reaching inside to remove her lipstick and a flashlight. She uses the lipstick and flashlight, together, to write a message on her window, hoping to negotiate her life with the masked killer. Instead, he reveals his face to her, and asks her if she can read his lips. Maddie nods. The killer begins to mock Maddie by repeating what her sister said earlier about coming home, being alone in the woods, and playfully threatening her about entering her home anytime he desires, but promising that he won't until she wishes she were dead. Maddie sits on her steps, frozen in fear and also despair, with only her flashlight in hand. She sneaks into the kitchen, readying herself. She picks up a knife and hammer, and locks herself inside of her bedroom, as she awaits her pursuer's next move. The killer, 2 steps ahead of her, taps on the windows of her bedroom, tapping on it slowly. She slowly looks over at the hand tapping on the window, and sees that it's her dead neighbor Sarah. And the killer stands behind her body, using her lifeless limb like a puppet. Waving to her, she slowly retreats back into the living room. Maddie's heart falls into her stomach. She falls to the ground, and begins to cry, as the realization of her friend being murdered begins to set in. While thinking of her, she remembers that Sarah placed her phone in her back pocket. She immediately runs to her purse in the kitchen, and picks up her car keys, and sets off her car alarm, watching as the masked man hastily walks towards the car to try and stop the noise. Once he's distracted, she runs back to the room and opens the window, where she finds Sarah's lifeless body lying below. She sifts through her pocket trying to find the phone, up until she sees the man return to the body, and immediately pushes herself back inside. The man nearly catching her, but luckily she shuts his hands in the window before he has the chance. They fight for control of the window, the killer overpowering her, almost prying it open. Maddie looks beside her, and sees her hammer on the floor, leaves the window, picks up the hammer, impaling him with its pointed end. He retreats in pain as Maddie gains control of the window, forcing it shut. She watches as he removes the hammer from his arm, in pain, and angrily staring at her. He reaches down for his knife, then back to Sarah's body, ripping off a piece of her bloody shirt to use as a bandage to stop the bleeding. Once he does, he reaches into his pocket and shows her Sarah's cracked phone, confidently waving it at her, knowing it was her goal to find it, placing it down on Sarah's body to tease Maddie, removing an earring from her ear to flaunt like a trophy. Fed up with his antics, she slowly backs away from the window, towards her living room. As he loudly knocks on her bedroom window attempting to get her attention, she closes the door behind her. In the living room, she tries to catch her breath, but her pursuer doesn't give her a chance as he casually walks around the house, taunting her. Maddie tries to hide away from his line of sight. The game of cat and mouse goes on for a while. He looks through the many windows of the cabin to find his prey, unable to find her. She attempts to sneak out of the back door. Once she's outside, he's already made his way back around, and she hides under her deck as he passes by back up towards the sliding door. She looks above through the cracks of the deck and places her hand on the wood to feel the vibrations of his footsteps. After looking for a moment, he realizes that she isn't inside and looks around outside to see if she has escaped. Realizing this, she places her hand over her mouth to hold her breath, hoping he doesn't realize where she is. And when he walks away again, she bolts out from under the deck towards the woods, but is stopped by a crossbow bolt just inches away from her face into the tree in her front yard. She looks over to see the man quickly reloading his crossbow after missing his first shots. As she runs back inside, closing the sliding door shut, locking it behind her, she falls to the floor and crawls backwards towards the stairs as she watches him slowly back to the sliding door, once again tapping on the glass, smiling at her with a bolt in hand, aiming the crossbow at her as he takes his leave. She makes her way to her attic to watch him through the highest window of the cabin. On the opposite side of the room is a window that opens, and she quietly makes her way outside again, on the roof of the cabin. Maddie tries to sneak around, watching him to find a place where she can jump off and make a run for it. She throws her flashlight off into the woods, catching the man's attention, causing him to walk towards the light in the woods. Once he does, she seizes the opportunity to get away, but is shot in the leg by a bolt. Unable to scream, she writhes in pain, looking down at him, and is almost shot in the head, but luckily she lies down in time and misses. Hurt by the wound, she courageously pulls the bolt out of her leg, as the man behind climbs up the side of the cabin to her. She agonizes over her wound but gets up after he places the crossbow on the roof as he tries to climb up. Maddie sees this and knocks him back down. As he gets up from his falls, he climbs back up and tries again. Maddie takes the crossbows and limps away from her pursuer and back into the windows from the roof, closing the window shut behind her, aiming the unloaded crossbow at his face, through the window. Impressed at Maddie having the upper hand the first time, he walks away. Once the coast is clear, the confident facade she once had fades, as she places her hand over the wound on her leg. While carrying the crossbow, she begins to limp around the house into her bathroom. She again writhes in pain, as she administers the alcohol over the wound, holding back her tears from the excruciating pain, then covering the wound. She lifts the crossbow again, and notices tally marks etched at its base, representing the number of bodies killed with the weapon. Disgusted, she proceeds to teach herself how to load it. The man watches as Maddie struggles to load the weapon. On the other side of her cabin, John, Sarah's boyfriend, loudly knocks on her front door, looking for Sarah. The killer hears the knocking, and doesn't hesitate to meet him on the other side, posing as a police officer. He flashes John with the same flashlight Maddie threw in the woods, the killer forcing John to get on his knees. Confused, John begins to explain his reason for being there. Now kneeling with his hands up, he shows the man his driver's license. After reading his identification, the killer, acting as if he was a police officer on call, knocked unconscious by a thief that broke into Maddie's home, asks to use John's phone, managing to convince him into letting him use it. He uses the device to make a fake phone call and hands the phone back to John, dropping Sarah's earring in the process. John notices and begins to question the man's story, asking who made the call, if Maddie was deaf and mute. The man, diverting the topic, continues asking John about Maddie's disability, John telling him her story, while also pointing to a spare key. Realizing that this man may very well be the killer, John reaches into a nearby planter and picks up a rock, while slowly pointing the killer in the direction of a spare key. Slowly inching his way towards him, John tightly grips the rock, about to strike. Maddie begins to beat on the glass of her door to warn John. He looks away from the killer, towards the direction of the noise. A knife pokes his throat. Realizing what happened, the disoriented John wobbles around towards the man swinging at him with a stone, missing every attempt, as the killer playfully pleads for him to stop, telling him it's over as John begins to bleed out. Maggie in agony watches as the killer antagonizes the dying man, dancing around John and saying his final remarks, thanking Maddie for showing up when she did, to aid him in a fight that he believed that he couldn't win. He flashes the light over John's limp body and moves closer to make sure he's dead. But John, playing possum, wakes up and tackles him to the ground. The two wrestle for a moment, as Maddie tries to quickly load the bolt on the crossbow, while at the same time watching their scuffle on the forest floor. The man, out of breath, after being tackled, attempts to crawl away but is grabbed by John, who places him in a headlock. Maddie stops for a moment and watches as she sees her first glimpse of hope. Instead of going to help John, she makes a run for it out of the back door and limps towards the forest. The man frees himself from John's grip. Seeing Maddie running, he picks up a stone and clobbers her over the head, standing over her, continually assaulting her with it. He finally stops. She lies there for a moment and quickly opens her eyes, muttering the words, "You can't run." It's her imagination. She snaps back to reality, looking out the window at what could have been. As the fear of death sets in, she releases the back door handle and slowly returns to the front door, where John finally succumbs to death and releases his grip on his killer. Maddie watches as the man takes a deep breath of life. She falls to her knees, as her mother's voice despairingly reminds her that she can't outrun him on her wounded leg, and how she can only use the crossbow as she hopes to survive. The voice of her mother becomes her own conscience, guiding her on how to get away. She devises a plan and plays out in her head how she lives or dies in their game of cat and mouse, playing it out like an ending to the novel of her story, until she comes to the clear conclusion that he has the advantage, and the one way to get away is to kill him. The man catches his breath and sits beside John's body, taking a sigh of relief at the realization he would have never won. He reaches into John's pocket and takes out a pack of cigarettes. He lights one of the cigarettes, then mocks the dead for being a smoker, and how smoking could kill him. As he's smoking, he asks John if he should go inside and kill Maddie, answering his own question by saying maybe he should wait. As he leans on the car, Maddie's cat finally comes home, right beside the killer. He draws his knife to kill the cat, but is immediately shot in the shoulder. Maddie, standing outside on her porch, dashes back into the house after realizing she missed the shot. On the way in, she accidentally drops her last bolt behind her, at the foot of the door, diving to reach for it, only to have her hand shut between sliding doors at full force by the killer. Her hand, now shut between the doorway, exposed, the man stomps down on it with all of his weight, breaking her wrist. He watches as she slowly falls, writhing in pain, rolling behind the glass of the locked door, and grasping her broken hand. To pour salt on the wound, he proceeds to take the bolt and snap it in half, but the pain of her wrist is too excruciating for her to notice. Enjoying what he sees, he grins and tells her, "I'm coming in." She reads his lips, and stops shortly after he says this, to angrily look up at him. Using the blood from her wound, she writes on the window, "Do it, coward." Accepting her challenge, he walks back to her car, picking up a tire iron, and proceeds to smash the window of the door in. Maddie begins typing on her laptop, a lead for the police, describing the killer, his height, eye color, and his many tattoos. And her final words are, "I love you, Mom, Dad, and Max. I died fighting." She runs back into her bathroom and locks the door. The man, unable to break the glass, stands in front of the sliding door. The glass above her begins to break as the killer falls from the ceiling above. Unnoticed as she awaits him to enter the doorway, he sits in the bathtub behind her and draws his knife to her back. Being the cocky man he is, he says, "If I hit the right spot, I bet I can make you scream." And as the words leave his lips, his breath grazes the back of her neck, causing her to realize that he is behind her. He lunges at Maddie, but misses. She flips the knife and stabs the unaware killer directly in the knee. The table turns as he cries in agony, dropping his knife from his hand. Maddie runs for the kitchen towards the knife holder. Her vision blurs again, even worse than the last time. She hobbles over to the knives and falls to the floor. The killer, not far behind, limps towards the kitchen, with a knife in hand. He sees her lying there, and slowly goes over towards her unconscious body. Standing over her, she slowly opens her eyes. They stare at each other for a moment. He moves in to finish the job, but is sprayed in the eyes with a can of bug spray lying by Maddie. Maddie places the can on the floor, and picks herself up. He moves around the room blindly. She then moves towards her smoke alarm lying on the table and turns it on. Now blind and both deaf, Maddie turns the tables, following him with a screeching alarm, causing the disoriented killer to drop his weapon again. Angrily, he charges towards her, knocking her down to the floor, kicking her multiple times, before standing over Maddie to choke her. A bottle opener falls to the floor beside her. They tussle repeatedly. He begins choking her. Maddie tries with all her might to find a way to remove his weight from her torso, quickly losing her life. As she takes her last breath, she is reminded of her childhood, happy photos crossing her mind as she looks in the face of death, and as she loses consciousness, her hand falls to her side, over the bottle opener. And with the last bit of strength she has, she picks it up and lodges it into his neck. As he loses blood, he also slowly loses his grip around her throat, allowing Maddie to breathe once again. She pushes his limp body to the side and lies on the floor to her disbelief. She reaches into his pocket and takes out her phone to dial for the police.